Welcome to the second series of our webinar, Building Resilient Cities. Our webinar today is on climate and energy resilience, redistributing power and strengthening social justice through renewable transformation. So I'm pleased to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Jennie Stephens, who is the Director of Northeastern School of Public Policy and Urban Affairs and Dean's Professor of Sustainability, Science and Policy. She's also the Director for Strategic Research Collaborations at Northeastern's Global Resilience Institute. Jennie's research, teaching, and community engagement focus on social, political aspects of renewable energy transformation, energy democracy, climate resilience, reducing fossil fuel reliance, gender diversity in energy and climate, and social, economic, and racial justice in climate and energy policy. Before coming to Northeastern, Jennie has taught at University of Vermont, Clark University, Tufts, and MIT. She earned her PhD and MS at the California Institute of Technology in Environmental Science and Engineering, and her BA at Harvard in Environmental Science and Public Policy. A very warm welcome to Jennie. Today, Dr. Stephens is going to highlight the renewable energy transition that offers opportunities to redistribute economic and political power, in addition to contributing to climate resilience as the transition that can help reduce vulnerabilities, injustices, and inequalities.
Well, thank you so much. It's an honor to be able to speak in this series, a very important series on building resilience. And my presentation and what I'm going to talk about is really focused on renewable transformation. Okay, so yeah, I'm going to be talking about climate and energy resilience and really thinking about the renewable transformation and thinking about how energy is at the core of so many things in society. So how we think about how energy is generated, how it's distributed, and how it's used really influences so many other things related to societal resilience. So that's kind of the overall. So when we think about the renewable energy and the shift, that's a gradual shift that is happening around the world, moving away from fossil fuel-based energy toward more renewable-based energy systems, we know that this helps reduce the risks of climate change because renewable energy doesn't emit greenhouse gases and carbon emissions the same way that fossil fuels do. But there are also many benefits beyond climate change that also are associated with this transformation from fossil fuel-based energy to renewable-based energy. And that's kind of what I focus on in my research, is these many other benefits in addition to climate change benefits. Offers other mechanisms for strengthening societal resilience. So before I start, I'd like to just tell a little bit about my own group, that all of you are from different backgrounds and different experiences. And I have an engineering and science background, as was mentioned in the introduction. And I was born and first lived in Ireland, Dublin, Ireland, and then moved to the United States when I was 8 years old. And I studied at Harvard, my first university degree in environmental science and policy, and then was very interested in water and water treatment as a critical issue in environmental science and policy. And then when I went to graduate school, interest in water and aquatic chemistry transitioned into also thinking about soil and carbon, and then that's where I became more interested actually in climate change from the water discussion. So then I've been a faculty member at Clark University, University of Vermont, and I'm now at Northeastern University, which is in Boston, Massachusetts. And I continue to have a very interdisciplinary perspective connecting science and engineering with policy and social science. And with these issues of resilience, it's this intersection of disciplines and sectors that's really important. Next. What I want to emphasize here is that resilience is one aspect, if you think about strengthening resilience, actually includes reducing inequities in society, because it really strengthening resilience means reducing vulnerabilities. So one definition of resilience is, or strengthening resilience is preparing for, adapting to, and learning from climate disruptions of all kinds. And then also integrating into that, thinking about how the concentration of wealth and power actually creates more vulnerability. So part of addressing resilience is also thinking about vulnerability and these inequities when we do see the impacts of climate change or other disruptions that some communities are much more vulnerable than others. So part of this, my orientation with my work is really acknowledging this that resilience really has to be also focused on reducing inequities. Next slide. So at Northeastern University, we have a Global Resilience Institute, which acknowledges this global need to confront disruptions of all kinds, and really focuses on both the social infrastructure as well as physical infrastructure. And we can think about abrupt disruptions like a big storm or a big disruption of some abrupt disruption, or also slowly emerging disruptions. And that's where the growing disparities and inequities in society across the globe is can be also seen as a slowly emerging disruption. So at Northeastern, the mission of the Global Resilience Institute is really to develop and deploy practical and innovative tools, applications, and skills to encourage both social and technological change that strengthens these capacities for more resilience. Next. And we have a wide breadth of impactful research that we work on, and strengthening climate resilience is definitely one piece of that. And then facilitating energy system resilience is another piece. So those are the two that I'm going to focus on today. Next slide. So at Northeastern, I'm also part of the School of Public Policy and Urban Affairs, where we focus explicitly on preparing leaders to address the complex problems, serve communities, and build a just and more resilient world. And so again, here we're really focused on the complexities of urban systems in particular, and the interdisciplinarity that is necessary to in the urban context. And we have various master's degrees and also a PhD program focused on sustainability and resilience. Next slide. So energy resilience is the focus of what I'm going to talk about today, and thinking about how energy systems connect with resilience. At Northeastern, we also have a collaborative on resilient energy, because if you think about energy and learning about energy and studying energy and doing research on energy, it's actually across campuses, across lots of different disciplines where people are doing work on energy. So we have a cross-campus initiative focused on energy and resilient energy systems, and we also have a master's degree focused on energy systems. So what I want to do now is get more into some thinking about and explaining these connections that aren't always top of mind when you think about renewable energy transformation and the societal resilience piece associated with it. So renewable energy really does provide resilience, and there are multiple different ways that renewable energy offer more resilient infrastructure than fossil fuels. Obviously, we are still very reliant on fossil fuels in a lot of our places around the world, and we see examples of when places that have transferred to more renewable energy in times of disruption can be more resilient. So obviously Puerto Rico, the big hurricane Maria that happened, work there and exploring the potential for renewable energy to really have changed the landscape and the resilience there. There's also examples of like solar traffic lights in Florida, here on the left, where, obviously when there is a disruption, if you have renewable energy to supplement the disrupted electric grid system, you have lots of possibilities. And then the other photograph here about Hurricane Harvey, Texas in the United States, and this is pointing out that there's fossil fuel infrastructure has lots of negative implications, and this was where there's toxic pollution associated with fossil fuels that was really caused a lot of vulnerabilities to people in that situation. So different ways that renewable energy can provide more resilience, and this is just a sampling here. So if you think about the island of Puerto Rico, where there was big disruption of the whole energy system, and there's really, when there is a big disruption, there's also an opportunity to rebuild with a different energy system, and we've been collaborating with colleagues at the University of Puerto Rico in really working toward trying to change the energy system to integrate more renewable energy, because obviously there's a lot of potential, and especially with islanded communities, renewable energy has a lot of benefits because we don't have to deal also with the transport of the fossil fuels. So I then want to connect to this issue of inequality, and energy systems, like many of other systems in society, are actually end up perpetuating inequalities unless they are intentionally advancing justice and equity considerations. So there's been quite a bit of research on inequality and minimizing suffering of vulnerable populations, and that is kind of central to some of our research. So in the remaining time, I want to kind of emphasize 3 points related to resilience and how resilience can be strengthened through renewable energy transformation. And the first relates to renewables can be more distributed in a different way than fossil fuel energy systems. So you can literally and figuratively redistribute the power among households, individuals, and communities. Number 2, I want to talk about strategically fossil fuel-based power. Obviously, many of our regions of the world are still very dependent on fossil fuel-based power. So it really requires some strategic thinking to move away from that and the current systems that perpetuate our fossil fuel reliance. And number 3, I want to talk about diversifying and redistributing who is making decisions. And this has to do with actually gender equity and racial equity and socioeconomic equity, is who's involved and who is benefiting and who is profiting from our energy systems. And so first of all, I want to just explain to everyone what I mean when I talk about concentration of wealth and power and the growing inequities. So the figure on the left here shows the United States, and the red line is the percent of wealth that is captured by the 1%, the top 1% of the population. So as you can see in the United States, that red line has been going up very. So basically, we have fewer and fewer people in the country that are own higher and higher percentage of the wealth. That is, on the left is the United States. On the right are other countries in the world, showing the same thing with the top 1%. So if you get the top 1% of any of these countries and see over time how much wealth of the nation's wealth is owned by the top 1%, you get these lines here, and you can see India is in the yellow, and it has also been increasing, not quite as dramatically as the United States perhaps, but also very, very very much increasing. So basically this is showing that inequality in all of these countries, all of our countries, has been increasing over time. And so more and more people, the wealth and power associated with that wealth is being concentrated. That creates growing inequities in the United States. It also is associated with racial inequities that are related to slavery and other social injustices, and it has created a lot of mistrust in society. And so the argument is that one way to address some of these issues, in addition to climate change and energy, is acknowledging how, when you move toward more renewable energy that is more distributed, you can also distribute the wealth and the power by literally and figuratively spreading out, moving from centralized fossil fuel energy to more distributed, so that individuals, households, and communities are profiting off of their energy systems and not big global multinational corporations. One concept and a growing social movement here in the United States is this idea of energy democracy, which is about redistributing power through this renewable energy transformation. And the vision really is to have a locally appropriate mix of renewable energy in every community. And so it's not all 100% solar or all wind or all geothermal or hydro. It's really each community and each place and region of the country or the world will have a different mix that's appropriate to whatever natural resources are available in that place. And this is a growing social movement, and it's really in large part in response to that concentration of wealth and power that I talked about on the previous slide, and also resisting corporate control of energy, because a lot of the global fossil fuel energy companies have been having a lot of influence not only on energy but on politics more generally in some of our countries. So the other important thing to think about here is time frame for change. And there's this, obviously with climate change becoming more and more of a concern among a lot of people, there's this opportunity to potentially harness the climate emergency to advance social justice and this thinking about the possibilities for how our energy systems can promote more equitable society is a key piece of that. And there's also, those of us who are concerned about thinking a lot about climate change can see an urgency there, and a lot of people are also see an urgency and outrage about other social injustices, and so the idea here is that to connect social justice issues and climate change issues together through energy transformation. That's number 2 on this list. And increasingly, there is resistance to fossil fuel infrastructure. This is a coal-fired power plant that was closed down here in Massachusetts, the state that I live in, and there was plans to put in a natural gas facility to replace the coal-fired power plant, and there were a lot of protests and people suggesting, and the community in the community saying, let's have renewable energy instead. Let's move from fossil fuels to renewables. And as I mentioned at the beginning, resisting fossil fuel infrastructure, there are many other benefits beyond climate change. And fossil fuels really have a lot of negative societal impacts, from all the way from the mining impacts in communities where the fuels are being mined or extracted. Also to the burning of fossil fuels obviously has a lot of health impacts. And those impacts to society are often not integrated into our decision making and into the costs of fossil fuels, because often fossil fuels can appear to be cheaper in some situations, but they really are not cheaper when we integrate these other costs that are also a result of using our reliance on fossil fuels. Next slide. So another concept that we have been doing some work on is this idea of embodied energy injustices, which is acknowledging that there are hidden and distant transboundary injustices associated with fossil fuels, from extraction and processing and transportation and disposal. So we often don't think of the full life cycle of our energy choices. We just are presented with a cost and what's accessible in each of our communities. And so there's increasingly consideration for thinking about the full life cycle of fossil fuels and also renewables, and then looking at the larger societal costs and resilience impacts of the choices that we're making. So the last point I wanted to talk about is diversifying who is involved in energy and how that contributes to resilience. And so I've done quite a bit of work exploring thinking about issues of gender in energy, and how energy is often kind of a very male-dominated sector, and a lot of decisions are made without thinking about the gender differences in how we think about our energy systems. So this is a photograph from the United States with signing a energy legislation that focuses on fossil fuels, not on renewable energy. And if you notice in this photograph, all the people in the photograph are men, and all the people have white skin. And in the United States, white men are actually only 30% of the population. But they are dominant in who has control and who's making decisions for everyone else. So in some of my work and our work, we think about a feminist lens, and a feminist lens really just means those who acknowledges that there are problems with gender equity and want to make changes to improve gender equity. And clearly our current president doesn't have a feminist lens, and very intentionally tries to promote and demonstrate, like in this photograph, that it's a certain kind of power, right, that is a very male-dominant power. And at the same time, this is promoting fossil fuel energy and not supporting renewable energy. So it's a very clearly, that's where the gender perspective is actually linked to kind of this fossil fuel dominant system, which is an interesting dynamic to be considered that we don't always think about when we think about energy policy. So one of the arguments that I sometimes make is that part of the reason that our responses to climate change are inadequate is because we have relied too much on very male-dominated technocratic responses, and some climate energy experts are promoting solutions that are very technology focused and that are not thinking about the social side. But right now we are seeing examples of more in the United States. We have Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who's promoting the Green New Deal. She is a young congresswoman, and that's who the picture on the left there is. Obviously, we have Greta Thunberg, who is providing the youth voice globally and also obviously she's also a young woman. And we have some other leaders that are encouraging kind of thinking more holistically about climate change and transitioning away from fossil fuels toward renewable energy. So I'll end here, and we can have some discussion and some questions, but I just want to also emphasize this is a quote from Mary Robinson, who's the former Irish president and the UN Human Rights Commissioner, and she wrote, "Climate change is a man-made problem that requires a feminist solution." So again, she's just another person who has connected some of these issues of social issues, issues of diversity and gender, and how they're connected to our thinking about the energy transformation and other challenges and opportunities with strengthening climate and energy resilience. So in conclusion, I would just say that energy transformation has huge potential for social, economic, and political change that could strengthen resilience and other kinds of resilience. But realizing that potential depends how we move away from how that transformation happens. There's also huge potential for diversifying and redistributing power. If we pay attention to these social issues of who is benefiting, who is being included, who is being excluded, who is being negatively impacted, and who's being well represented in the decision making. The landscape is changing rapidly. I like to put up this just to say we have to change the rules, because if you tried to play football on this field when it's on a hill like this, it wouldn't work, right? Like you wouldn't be able to play the game. And similarly, the landscape is changing so quickly. We have to be innovative and anticipate. We can't play by the same rules and the same assumptions and disciplines that we have in the past. Where we bring together the research, but also the practice of thinking about resilience and also our consumption patterns and how social justice is integrated into that, especially as we think about more and more urban context. So if anyone's interested, just to say thank you for listening, and thanks to some of my research team that I work with here at Northeastern. And I will just mention I have a 2015 book on smart grid revolution. And my next book that I'm working on now that will come out next year is actually about diversifying power to save the world. So I'm actually going to I'm focusing more on this issue of diversity and making sure getting better representation into thinking about climate and energy resilience, so that to strengthen future resilience.
Great. Thank you, Jenny. Basically for highlighting the need to leverage this phase of energy transition to reduce inequalities